The views expressed, opinions given, and any communication made between the hosts and guests of What Are You Afraid of Horror and Paranormal Show do not necessarily reflect the views or opinions of Para X Radio, EMC Network, or all services that play this show. The hosts and services are not responsible for the actions of their guests, and the original rights of all intellectual property is retained by the creator, and all work is used with either permission or Creative Commons license. The show is for entertainment purposes only. I'm horror author T. Fox Dunham.
And I'm horror author and filmmaker Phil Thomas.
And tonight we're asking you,
what are you afraid of? Philadelphia's horror home with hosts T. Fox Dunham and Phil Thomas.
it's times like this, Phil.
It's times like this.
Sitting in a plague and an epidemic, which apparently is being propagandaed away, I like to think about serial killers, especially serial killers from the 19th century.
Oh, is that what you do during a pandemic?
I do. You know, this is actually my first pandemic, and I'm finding myself whiling away the time by thinking about serial killers.
Interesting.
I know.
Interesting.
And since we're doing this show, What Are You Afraid of? Because this has been the one sort of element on my calendar that has kept me stable since in March when we all went homebound. How are you doing, by the way, Phil?
Oh, I'm doing pretty good. I'm doing good, you know. I am also, contemplating serial killers during this time.
Oh, good.
Especially Jack the Ripper, and also vampires.
Oh, excellent. Vampires, Jack the Ripper, and serial killers, okay.
I'm planning on watching Salem's Lot.
Oh.
The film for, this is embarrassing, but for the first time.
That's okay. I've never seen it.
You've never seen it either? Okay.
Never seen it.
So I'm not the only one.
It was kind of before our time.
I have it on Blu-ray, but I've never watched it. So it came with a Stephen King box set, but I am going to watch it hopefully tonight.
Excellent. Well, this is episode 144, Who Was Jack the Ripper? I'm T. Fox Dunham.
And I'm Phil Thomas.
And this is What Are You Afraid of? Horror and Paranormal Show. We're on Para X Radio, Friday nights at 9 p.m. Eastern Time. Check out our website at www.whatareyoufraidofpodcast.com for all previous 143 episodes, plus an archive of our ghost stories and some other cool content that we're doing, like interviews with the Crash Code people from Bloodbound Books, the wonderful people who published my novel, Mercy. But this is a fun episode. I'm glad everyone's here, episode 144. We've got a gentleman on the show who hails from Australia. His name is Paul Williams. Now, Paul is a writer living in Australia, but he is originally from the United Kingdom, like our beloved David Walton. His work includes non-fiction books on Jack the Ripper, cryptozoology, and wolves. He has written for periodicals such as Ripperologist and BBC History, with his short fiction appearing in a range of magazines and anthologies. He's had stories in Doctor Who short trips. That's where I know him from, because I was a huge fan. I would get a hardback copy of the Doctor Who short trips every Christmas because they were mostly used, and I would just burn through them, and I recognized his name from an anthology that I'm in with him from Grey Matter Press called Omnious Realities, and he submitted a story for a new anthology coming out from Gutter Books about the music of Pink Floyd, a charity anthology called Coming Through in Waves. Now, I know the editor personally of that anthology.
Yeah.
I gotta say, I can't say 100% who's being accepted because I sort of agreed that I wouldn't do that. But, you can't see me winking, can you? No, I'm winking here and it's not coming through. Okay. But it's an incredible story. It blew my mind. It just jumped outside the box. Had a very Mark Twain-like feel to it, sort of like afterlife, heaven and hell, other worlds, these worlds, and I just loved it. It's going to add such a nice, delightful element to the show and to the anthology. Paul from Australia, Paul Williams, how are you today?
I'm good, thank you, Fox. Thanks for inviting me on your show.
Absolutely. Welcome to What Are You Afraid Of? Now, this show is dedicated to our dear friend Bill Gill, who is a Jack the Ripper addict, and good old Bill. And he actually did the research on the questions for you, so thank you, Bill. Thank you very much. Now, Paul here wrote a book called Jack the Ripper Suspects, the Definitive Guide and Encyclopedia. In the autumn of 1888, a serial killer known as Jack the Ripper stalked the East End of London, Whitechapel. He was never identified, but hundreds of people were accused. Some were known to the authorities at the time, and others were named by later researchers. The truth about them and the reasons why they came under suspicion is often lost in a plethora of opinions and misinformation. For the first time, his book presents the evidence against 333 suspects. So, Paul, jumping into this, just for our audience, to get started, could you tell us a little bit about Jack the Ripper, his murders, and what happened then?
Sure. So in Whitechapel in 1888, a man was killing prostitutes. There are at least 5 murders that are definitely attributed to him, but there are 11 murders in the Metropolitan Police files, covering a period from 1888 to 1892.
Well, fantastic. And, of course, we all know about Jack the Ripper, Bloody Jack, and he has been legendary and one of the really first known serial killers. Serial killer, of course, is a phenomenon that sort of hit the United States in the last 100 or 200 years. There are many countries that don't recognize serial killers, even though they do pop up. I'm thinking of, like, the Soviet Union, Chikatilo, Citizen X. That's an incredible story of serial killers. And the interesting thing is we never found out. Most serial killers get caught eventually because they just have, like you said, a plethora of victims. And Gentleman Jack, we never found out who he was.
No. No, we never did. It's a story that always intrigued me, too, because I don't think we ever will, definitively. I mean, unless some DNA evidence that we can uncover.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? But
sure.
I think the mystery is one of the most intriguing things about it.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, because we don't know. It's been over 100 years,
mm-hmm.
and we still don't know who he was.
Yeah.
We suspect he was a doctor
mm-hmm.
because of his, surgical skills. Who knows? So, Paul, how did you get interested in Jack the Ripper?
Well, when I was a child, I'd go to my local library and I'd read as much as I could. And I moved on to the adult books about Jack the Ripper and true crime in general. And there was a book by a guy called Stephen Knight, The Final Solution, which is one of the most famous books about Jack the Ripper. And Knight alleged that there was a wide Masonic conspiracy implicating the royal family and various members of Parliament. And that got me hooked, and I was intrigued by the cover-up and the idea that this guy who killed prostitutes in the East End of London was connected to a much wider picture of Victorian life. Subsequently, of course, I found out that Knight's book is fictitious in the most part, but it engaged me at the time, and it opened up a range of possibilities and made me think about those wider issues. And subsequently, as a historian, I've looked a lot at the 19th century, at the social conditions of the time, and it really was a melting pot. It was a period that has a lot of similarities to our own. There's lots of problems of immigration, a very big Jewish population in the East End that was perceived to be taking jobs from the locals, and Irish and other nationalities thrown into the mix. So there's a lot of concerns, a lot of poverty, which is really the heart. The British Empire was, the biggest organisation on the planet at that time, and it was centred in London, but just a few miles away were these absolute slums where people lived in extreme depredation. So there's that contrast as well. And I think anyone who looks at the Victorian society will see that there is that big difference between the haves and the have-nots. And again, I think that comes back to today and has a lot of relevance to our own situation, where that gap between the rich and poor is quite prominent, particularly in certain cities.
Right, and at a time when there was no such thing as the middle class, it was FDR who invented the middle class with his New Deal, and so that's interesting. Jack the Ripper is a social problem.
Yes, it was, and in fact there are some fiction about Jack the Ripper which credit him with being a social reformer, because such was the publicity attached to Jack's crimes that people started getting more involved in social work in the East End and trying to clean it up, improve the housing, and just generally tidy up. And they got concerned about the welfare of the poor for perhaps the first time, because it tended to be ignored a lot by those upper classes, that they weren't really interested in what was going on. Even though a lot of them actually lived there, because there wasn't the mobility we have now, where today I think if you're a doctor or a lawyer or you have a higher income, you tend not to live in the slums. You tend to move further out of town and commute into where you're working. But in those days, although the railways started to take off, there was a lot of doctors and lawyers and people who actually lived in Whitechapel close to what was going on. So, of course, they would have an opinion on it, and they would fear for their own safety. And another interesting aspect was that because it was widely publicised, a lot of aristocrats started coming down to the East End to have a look and see if they could perhaps find the killer. And in fact, some of them got arrested doing that. There are some quite famous people who came around and walked about in slouch coats and got pulled over by the police because they looked suspicious. If you think about an East End pub which is full of, working class types, and suddenly this aristocrat comes in and starts ordering drinks and asking questions, there's a bit of resentment there. And I think that's built over quite a lot. And you see that social division reflected.
Yeah, East End boys and West End girls, right?
Oh, yeah. Nice.
Well, yeah. And in fact, there was one of the victims had worked in the West End, or so she said, and she's the one that we know the least about because her backstory was largely fictitious. But she actually had come from a West End brothel, a more upmarket situation, obviously with different clientele, and somehow she ended up in a hovel in the East End. So her story is really a decline from, I won't say a better place, because it obviously depends on everyone's opinion of prostitution is, but obviously if you're working in a high-class brothel and suddenly you're on the streets, there's a definite decline there. Possibly because as she got older, that the more exclusive clients were less interested.
Oh, see,
interesting.
That's terrible, being phased out as you get older as a prostitute. Somebody should write that story. We will be right back with the great Paul Williams from Australia on episode 144, Who Was Jack the Ripper, on What Are You Afraid Of? Horror and Paranormal Show. We are moving into our summer of ghost stories and horror here as America sort of wakes up from this terrible epidemic. Might be too soon, might not be. Guess we will see. We'll be right back with Paul in episode 144.
This is Joe R. Lansdale, creator of the Hap and Leonard series, and you're listening to me and others on Fox and Phil.
What are you afraid of?
Rat! Rat! Where are you going?
I'm going back to the Paranormal View, back where I belong.
Please, take me with you.
No, I'm through with everything here. I want to see if there's something left in life I haven't explored. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Oh, Rat, don't run to them. They talk about ghosts and hauntings, UFOs, and all kind of supernatural scary stuff.
You'll never understand, will you, Scarlet?
No!
Well, that's your misfortune.
Rat, if you go, where shall I go? What shall I do?
Frankly, my dear... Line!
Oh, you gotta be kidding.
That's the Paranormal View with your host, Henry Foister, Jeffrey Gould, and Barbara Duncan. Every Saturday night at 8 p.m. Eastern, exclusively on the
We're back with
X
Paul
Radio
Williams on
Network.
episode 144. So, Phil, you're still surviving the epidemic, still hanging out, keeping busy?
Yeah, I'm still surviving. I'm still keeping busy, listening to music, doing a little bit of writing, some editing, working, writing articles, just, trying to get through all this, reading a lot. I'm doing a lot of reading lately.
Because
Netflix.
You've been reading Grady's book.
I've been reading Grady Hendrix' new book, yes.
He'll be on the show actually next week. Grady Hendrix will be on.
Yes, he will.
We just had Scott Kennemore on. Scott was great bringing the zombies. That was episode 143.
And Grady will be on, I believe.
Next episode.
Next episode,
yep,
yeah.
145.
The Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires. Mm-hmm. And I'm very much enjoying it.
And we've got Daniel Kraus coming on, who, my wife, she's got such a reputation in the horror community, and I've taken her to meet.
Why is that?
Because I've taken her to meet. You've been to my events, to the show events, and we've got horror authors. We're members of the Horror Writers Association, and she has such a reputation with them. And I told her Daniel Kraus was coming on, who co-wrote the book The Shape of Water, which is a great movie. We saw it down the shore the one year, and of course she looks at me and she goes, "Can you ask him if he can write a better ending?" This is my wife.
Hopefully he won't listen to this episode.
She is notorious for this kind of stuff, and she's tough. And I take her to these events, and everyone's a little intimidated by her, and I'm okay with that. But we are back on episode 144. Who was Jack the Ripper, with the wonderful Paul Williams. So, Paul, you wrote a great book. You investigated evidence against 333 suspects. How did you research the book?
A lot of it was compiling what had been written about people in the past, so it's more like an encyclopedia, going through what people have written, what has been discovered, and collating that into one volume. And more importantly, put it into a narrative, so you can see it's structured in the lines of people who are suspected at the time, people who are arrested, people who are suspected later for specific reasons. So it actually has a continuity to it, so you can follow through the police investigation and then the theories of later researchers. And it really tracks from those contemporary suspects, the people who got picked up because they looked a bit dodgy, or they said something that was suspicious, right through to the later candidates, where researchers have gone back into history and picked out a candidate that they feel, with the benefit of hindsight, could have been involved in the murders. So there's a real melting pot, and it covers all social bases, going right from from royalty right down to tramps, and there's even some ladies in there as well. Jill the Ripper, you might say.
Oh, interesting.
And quite a few Americans as well. In fact, one of the main suspects was an American, a guy called Francis Tombletti, who is regarded certainly in the top 4 of plausible suspects. But yeah, there's quite a few people from the States. H.H. Holmes was mentioned as well, that a famous American serial killer, although the evidence again. Yes, he did, yes. He almost certainly was not in Whitechapel in 1888, but he's one name that has been put forward. So it's interesting, I think, that people do that they write a book where they accuse someone without any real evidence. And I think there's a problem there perhaps with the publishing industry accepting that type of stuff, but also with the individuals themselves wanting to exaggerate and invent and distort the facts of history. And that can be quite dangerous as well, because people who only read that book might believe it. I also think that for the descendants of some of those people as well, it must be quite embarrassing to have your relative associated with Jack the Ripper, particularly if the evidence is clear that he wasn't involved. So I think there's lots of things to think about there.
Yeah, I know. I wouldn't like, to have a great-grandfather of mine accused of being Jack the Ripper if there was no solid evidence, Yeah. And that leads me to think, what do you make of Stephen Knight or others that have similar theories concerning groups of people comprising Jack the Ripper, or of the Masonic theory or theories in general?
Well, I think everyone's entitled to a theory, but it needs to be based on solid foundations. And the big problem I have with any type of conspiracy is that inevitably someone is going to talk. If you've got a group of 6, 10, 12 people who are involved in a secret, over time, one of them will let slip that involvement to somebody. Perhaps not intentionally, but, they go out, have a drink and tell someone, or they get senile in their old age. I think it's very, very hard to keep that sort of thing secret over a long period of time. So that's my first objection. But when you analyse Knight's theory in a lot of detail, you can see there's so many cracks in it. First of all, it's based on the idea that Queen Victoria's grandson, Prince Albert Victor, married a Catholic secretly and had a child by her. Now, the theory is that the Masons didn't want that coming out because they feared that would cause a rebellion because society was predominantly anti-Catholic.
Damn papists. Damn papists, yeah.
That's right. Although the Home Secretary at the time was actually a Catholic, the first one to hold that post since the Reformation. So there had been some progress made, but it was still a very divisive society where the Church of England was the dominant religion. Jews, Catholics, other Christian denominations, Muslims, they weren't really credited, and they were often discriminated against actively. So there was this idea, but it doesn't stand up because the marriage itself was illegal. The legislation had been put in place centuries ago to prevent it. So if it did come out, they could just say, no, that marriage is null and void anyway, even if it happened, which it didn't.
Right.
And then
George III. I'm sorry, go ahead.
That's right. But then there's the whole thing as well. If you're a government and you want to stop some prostitutes blackmailing you about a big secret, the last thing you want to do is kill them all individually over a 6-month period and generate lots of publicity. You've got the power to take them out quietly without anyone knowing. You could cover up deaths to make them look accidental and things like that. So, and you probably try and do it all at the same time, because if you kill one of them in this manner and then the last one doesn't die until 8 weeks later, in that interim period, aren't they more likely to go and talk to people about why this is happening? Won't they figure it out? So there's lots of issues there. And the central theory tonight is that 3 men basically went round in a coach, catching the prostitutes, disembowel them inside the coach and dumping the bodies. Now, that doesn't fit in with the evidence of where the bodies were found. There's no record of anyone in a coach at that time. The evidence is very, very clear that these ladies were killed on the sites where they were located and the bodies found. And also the person doing the disembowelment inside the coach was the Queen's surgeon, Sir William Gull, who was very old by that point. He had a stroke the year before. And so the idea that he was sitting in this coach, driving around London, lowering the ladies into it, cutting them open and chucking them back out is quite frankly ludicrous. But it was believed by a lot of people in the 1970s, and even now, when you talk about Jack the Ripper, people will say, wasn't it something to do with the royal family? And I think that's the perception which has taken off because of that book. It's quite phenomenal, really. It's an exercise in misinformation and manipulating the public to a point of view, which obviously quite a few politicians do today. So yeah, it's a good book, by the way, and I think it's worth reading, but don't take it seriously.
Oh, fantastic! I guess Bill will like that very much, and I just have to think. I wonder if Bill is actually Jack the Ripper. He's gone back in time, murdered prostitutes. And well, getting back to what our dear friend was saying, just a little background for our audience, and I love the references that Jack the Ripper was really a political effect, especially during the time. A lot of Americans don't understand this, where religion is actually a part of nationality, especially in places like Great Britain, where you had the Reformation coming in and things like that, but was that King George II of Hanover, he put into an act that said, the Royal Marriage Act, that any descendant before the age of 25 wasn't allowed to be married unless the king gave permission. But this was a big problem for George IV. And of course you have the Roman Catholic Relief Act of 1829, which stated that no Catholics could be in government. So there was this period where Catholicism and of course Anglican faith had this real battle going on. It's interesting that a lot of these theories came from this conflict between Catholicism, Papists as they were called, which was the nationality of like France or Spain, and of course they didn't get along very well with Great Britain. But moving on, okay, so Bill wants to know, our dear friend Bill, so do you have any suspects you think that likely were Jack the Ripper?
I wouldn't say likely, but in the book I went through the evidence against each suspect, and I said this is why they're accused, and this is what why the evidence is reliable or not. And I found that there were 10 people where the evidence probably warrants further investigations. And if it was a police investigation now, you'd look at those 10 people very closely. I don't think there'd be enough to bring any of them to court and put them on trial for crimes, but there's certainly 10 that you'd look at and think, can we gain further evidence? Can we really investigate their antecedents very, very, very closely and see what we can find out? So those 10 people, I'll go through the names very quickly. First one was Aaron Kosminski, who was a Polish Jew who lived in the area, and he was actually named afterwards by senior police officers as being the main suspect. And he went to an asylum 2 years after the crimes, where he wasn't noted to be violent, which is the first reason why you start to doubt what the police said about him. But certainly he was the person that they regarded as the prime suspect. Francis Tombletti, an American quack doctor who popped across the channel regularly. He was a homosexual, and he had a hatred of prostitutes, which is documented. And he was in the East End at the time, and he was actually arrested for homosexual offences. Then he jumped bail just after the last Ripper murder, went across to France, and then came back to the States, where he spoke openly about being arrested and about his experience and criticised the British police. Then you have Montague Druitt, who was named by another senior police officer. Druitt was a barrister and school teacher who committed suicide shortly after the last Ripper murder. The police officer had private information that implicated Druitt. A lot of research has been done into where that information came from. They found various connections through the aristocracy, but we have no solid evidence against him other than that opinion. And also the belief that Jack the Ripper committed suicide after the last crime because serial killers die, get arrested, or have something happens to them. They don't just stop killing. That's a very common theory. And a lot of the theories do centre around the last victim that they believe and say something must have happened to the killer after that to explain why the murder suddenly stopped. Then we have James Kelly, who has the record for the longest escape from Broadmoor, the premier lunatic asylum in the United Kingdom. He killed his wife in the 1880s because he thought she was a prostitute, but he wasn't executed because of his sanity. He was sent to Broadmoor. He managed to escape from there in the year of the Ripper murders. He went overseas and he came back 30 years later at the gates of Broadmoor and was let back in and died there. So no one really knows what he was doing in those 30 years. We have his own account of what happened, but we don't know the full details because none of it's been verified. But certainly he was someone who had form in that area. So he was a likely suspect in my view, but of course no evidence against him. Then we have William Granger, or Grant, as he's sometimes called. And he was arrested for attacking a prostitute some years after the Ripper murders, and his solicitor believed that he was actually Jack the Ripper. And then we come to William Berry, who killed his wife the following year in Dundee. He fled London after the Ripper murders with his wife and killed her. I went to the police station and tried to make out for an accident, but he wasn't believed and got executed. But there was graffiti on his house in Dundee which said Jack the Ripper is in this cellar. So, and there's similar, and his wife, after she was killed, she wasn't killed in the same way as to her victim, but there was an attempt to mutilate the body, which could be seen as the same method as the Ripper, but we're not certain on that point because, of course, it could have just been Berry had read about the Ripper and was trying to make it look like a Ripper victim. Then we had the poisoner, George Chapman, and that wasn't his real name. He was a Polish Jew who was actually living in Whitechapel in 1888. He poisoned 3 of his common law wives before he was executed in the early 20th century. And again, a police officer at the time, Inspector Aberlin, one of the most famous police officers involved in the Ripper case, he told the newspaper that he thought Chapman was probably Jack the Ripper. And then the other three, we have Thomas Cutbush, who was a lunatic who was wandering around at the time. And he was committed to an asylum after women were stabbed in the back. And there were pictures found in his property of women being cut up, which suggested that perhaps he had this fascination with the Ripper murders. And then we have David Cohen, with the late Martin Fider, who wrote a very good book about Jack the Ripper. He was the one who identified Aaron Kosminski in the records, but he couldn't reconcile what those records said about Kosminski with the suspect called Kosminski described by the police. And he found there was a Polish Jew called David Cohen who was committed to an asylum very shortly after the Ripper crimes and was extremely violent. And he argued that the two suspects had been confused. And the final one is a conman called Charles Lee Grand, who was also a pimp, and he was active in Whitechapel at the time, and he was actually involved in the vigilante committees. And when he went to jail for various offences later on, there were allegations that he was Jack the Ripper that came out in the media. So those are the 10 people that I think are the most likely out of those known so far, but I wouldn't convict any of them if it went to court today.
Right. That's very interesting. It seems like a lot of them also had a very huge disdain for prostitution. So I think that any one of them, like you said, could be a suspect. And could you tell our audience about the Gulston Street graffito, and what is your take on it?
Yes, so Gulston Street graffiti. So on one night, Jack the Ripper killed 2 ladies. There is a dispute as to whether it was both the crimes, but the similarities in the timing suggest that they were. Now, after killing Catherine Eddowes, he obviously ran away. A piece of Eddowes' apron was taken, and it was found blood-stained beneath a piece of graffiti that looked to be fairly fresh. And that graffiti, there's some dispute as to what it actually said, because the records of the police officer at the time are slightly inconsistent, and it wasn't photographed. They had rudimentary photography then, but they refused to photograph it because of the time it would take to get the cameras there. They were scared that there'd be a riot if people came out and read the graffiti. So it said, or variation of this, the Jews are not the men that will be blamed for nothing. And Jews is spelled Juwes. So now there are 2 possibilities. One is that the graffiti was already there and the apron was just chucked into a corner and are completely unconnected events. The other is that the Ripper deliberately dropped the apron there and wrote this comment on the wall. And obviously you can't prove either way. Police officers who passed the area 30 minutes before the apron was found were quite clear that the apron and the graffiti weren't there at the time. But against that, you have the fact that if you look at where Eddowes was murdered and where Gulston Street is, it was only a short walk. So it's some time has elapsed before the apron is discovered. So that would mean that Jack the Ripper had gone somewhere else and then come back out deliberately to deposit the apron, as opposed to just dropping it when he ran past. So we don't know is the honest answer to that. I think it's an interesting piece of graffiti. It could mean anything. In the contents of Jack the Ripper writing it, was he a Jew who was trying to divert suspicion from the Jews? Was he a Gentile who was trying to incriminate the Jews? We don't know. It's one of the things that we just have to keep speculating about, because we'll never really be certain as to whether it is connected or not. All we can say is that the piece of apron is a definite clue, and it tells us that Jack the Ripper passed through Gulston Street at some point in that evening before the apron was discovered.
Excellent.
Interesting.
Excellent. By the way, for our fans, we usually do a narrated ghost story or have one of our guests tell us a ghost story every episode. So let me just put this in here. Now, we know that we've been talking about that I've been seeing and feeling the presence of a ghost over in the main house where we do our laundry. And we haven't had much, noise from this ghost in the last few months since we've come here. That often happens where people start to settle down. But the other day, coming up the stairs after going out we went to the park. I went to do a little fishing. I swear I saw a sort of gray mist at the top of the stairs that dissipated coming up and felt that same presence. So maybe the ghost here is on the ground. But that's for our fans listening who
it was a gray mist?
Yeah, sort of a gray mist coming up the stairs. And I thought to myself, something's on fire. You know? But there was no smell of smoke or anything. And then I got upstairs and it was gone. So our little ghost story.
Oh.
We'll have more ghost stories coming up on future episodes, but we are talking to the amazing Paul Williams on episode 144, Who Was Jack the Ripper, with a great interview written by our friend Bill Gill. So, Paul, we're listening to these incredible details, and I'm learning a great deal about this old murder mystery that has fascinated so many generations. Do you think any of the letters sent to the press were authentic, like perhaps the Dear Boss letter?
To be honest, Fox, no, I don't. It was a very, very clever letter. It actually is the reason why we're here today, because it gave the publicity to the crime. So a letter and a postcard was sent to the Central News Agency, purporting to become from the killer, and they gave him the name Jack the Ripper, which obviously the media seized upon and created this legendary character that we know now. The general feeling is that those letters were hoaxes to drum up business for the newspapers, and at this time the newspaper industry was really starting to take off because of cheaper printing and rising levels of literacy, but there was a lot of competition, a lot of newspapers trying to outdo each other. They were slowly becoming more sensational in some of the topics that they were looking at. There was a lot of opinions in them, and so the generally accepted theory is that it was written by a journalist to try and generate more business, which explains why it was sent to the Central News Agency that coordinated reports across the district rather than to a specific newspaper or even to the police. However, there is one piece of Ripper correspondence that I would be more inclined to think might be genuine, and that was a letter sent to a vigilante called George Lusk, and it was sent with a piece of kidney. Now, Jack the Ripper removed a kidney from the body of Catherine Eddowes. So George Lusk received this parcel with a letter saying, Mr. Lusk, here is the kidney that I took from the lady. So now, we can't say if it was Catherine Eddowes' kidney or not, because the technology at those days couldn't do so. But it was a kidney that had been taken from a body at some point. It hadn't been preserved, as would have been the case if it was taken by a medical student, say. So someone somewhere got hold of a kidney and sent it along to a vigilante. And I think it's possible that was the real killer, possibly responding to some of the Jack the Ripper letters, because if you've gone out and done these horrible crimes and somebody else is taking credit for them, and it's all over the newspapers, you might feel a bit, I don't know, resentful, and you might want a bit of publicity for yourself. But the handwriting and the way that letter is written is very different to the Dear Boss letter. So it's unlikely they're written by the same person.
Very interesting perspective. Yeah, that sounds like it could very well be, I mean, who knows, the one. I mean, do you personally think that there is any hope of a verifiable answer to the Jack the Ripper identity or identities now or in the future?
I would think it unlikely, because although we're constantly finding out new things about the suspects, there's a whole heap of researchers who have now got access to material they didn't have before. A lot of the newspapers are now digitized and they're all over the internet, and there's lots of archival records that are slowly coming online as well, which makes it easy for people to find information and to put two and two together. But I think to prove the case, you'd need to have some hard and fast evidence, which we haven't got eyewitnesses that could confirm that.
Do you think there is any hope of a verifiable answer to the Jack the Ripper identity or identities?
I think it's very unlikely. Obviously, as time goes on, researchers are finding out more and more about individual suspects. We've got access to a wider range of records now, with newspapers and other archival material being digitized. But I think you'd need to have a convincing piece of hard evidence against one suspect, which simply isn't there, because none of the eyewitness statements can be taken as 100% reliable, and none of them can be matched to a currently known suspect. Your only hope then is forensics. The possibility that there will come along some kind of forensic link between one of the victims and a possible killer. Now, a few years ago, such a discovery was mooted in the press, and there was a book about it, which basically alleged that the shore of Catherine Eddowes was connected to Aaron Kosminski by DNA. Now, that unfortunately has been severely discredited, firstly because the DNA analysis was incorrect in terms of making out the probability of it coming from someone other than Kosminski was completely wrong. And secondly, there is no contemporary evidence that that shawl actually belonged to Catherine Eddowes. So it's an interesting idea, and it will be nice to think that there is a possibility of being able to extract DNA and compare it to a suspect, but I don't think it's going to happen personally.
Excellent. Well, some mysteries are just a lot of fun remaining mysteries, though it doesn't provide a lot of peace to the victims. We are on episode 144, Who Was Jack the Ripper? Speaking to Australian author from the UK, Paul Williams. Now, Paul is in a book that is coming out in July, edited by Mitzi Soreto, The Best New True Crime Stories, Small Towns. It's a collection of non-fiction accounts by international writers and experts on small town crimes. It shows that, the readers, that the real monsters aren't hiding in the woods. They're inside our towns. Tiny town, big crime. Whether in Truman Capote's detailed murder of the Clutter family or Ted Bundy's small town charm, criminals have always roamed rural America and towns worldwide. Featuring murder stories, criminal case stories, and more, the Best New True Crime Story, Small Towns, contains all new accounts from writers of true crime, crime journalism, and crime fiction. And these entries are not based on a true story. They are true stories. Edited by acclaimed author and anthologist Mitzi Soreto, the stories in this volume span the globe. Discover how unsolved murders, kidnapping, shooting sprees, and violent robbery and other bad things can happen in small towns all over the world. So that anthology is going to be out on Amazon. We'll have a link at our website at www.whatayouafraidofpodcast.com, where you can find all previous 143 episodes, plus our archive of true ghost stories with audio narrated versions by mostly by our beloved voice singer, David Walton, who is in Plymouth and surviving the plague with his beloved spouse. This is episode 144, Who Was Jack the Ripper, with Paul Williams. We'll be right back with some final questions for the author and his story, Atonement of the Ripper, on What Are You Afraid Of?
Mercy, a new horror medical thriller from author T. Fox Dunham, published by Bloodbound Books. Based on the author's horrific battle with a rare form of lymphoma that involved intense chemotherapy and radiation, Fox turns the horror of his experience into terror on the page.
William Saint is dying of cancer. On most days, death seems like a humane alternative to the treatment. Stricken with fever, William is rushed to Mercy, notorious as a place to send the sickest of the poor and uninsured to be forgotten, and finds the hospital in even worse condition than his previous visit.
Willie's memories faded. He grabbed his sack head of the scarecrow, picking at the exposed chicken wire to hold them in. However, the memories fell out of the holes in his face. They wormed and crawled from the leather flesh and the old clothing of the scarecrow, then squirmed and wiggled down his body.
The grounds are unkempt, the foundation is cracking, and like the wild mushrooms sprouting from the fissures of decay around it, something is growing inside the hospital. Something dark.
Fangoria gives Mercy 3.5 out of 4 skulls. Dunham has channeled his many brushes with the other side into the exquisitely rendered, lyrical, supernatural hospital thriller Mercy.
It's feeding on the sickness and sustaining itself on the staff, changing them, and now it wants Willie.
And now, Mr. Saint, just a little more of that sweet milk. So salty and so good. You won't miss it. And we ever do so like our delicacies here at Mercy Hospital.
Part medical horror, part supernatural suspense, Mercy is a hard-hitting fever dream of a novel. I enjoyed the hell out of it. Tim Wagner, author of The Way of All Flesh and Eat the Night. Available from Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and bookstores everywhere in both print and digital versions.
Life is an addiction.
Let go. Let it all burn.
I'm Jenna Valadez with The Basement Files. Tune in Friday nights, 6 p.m. Central, 7 p.m. Eastern, right here on the ParaX Radio Network.
We're back on episode 144 talking about the notorious Jack the Ripper, a murder story that will go unsolved because it's just too old for evidence besides anecdotal evidence and historical evidence, and it's fun to speculate and postulate, but it's just too old to figure out who the murderer is. Okay, so these questions came from our friend Bill Gill. I love Bill, and I'm so glad we could do this episode for him, keep him entertained during this time when he's stuck at home and not at Barnes & Noble drinking coffee and reading books. Paul, now do you accept that there are only 5 canonical victims as Jacks?
Personally, I don't. And there's several reasons for that. And I think when you actually look at all the murders together, I think the murder of Martha Tabram, which occurred prior to the Jack the Ripper murders, has a lot of similarities in terms of the ferocity of the attack. So someone stabbed Martha Tabram 39 times. And to me, that is not a normal murder. That is a level of violence that is different to a casual dispute between a client and a prostitute where someone gets knocked over, stabbed, etc. This is deliberately going back and attacking someone with an amount of force. And I don't think it's coincidental that just a few weeks after that we get into the Jack the Ripper murders. The reason why Tabram isn't connected to them is largely because her throat wasn't slashed in the way that the other victims were. But, you know, when we talk about serial killers, we can't assume they always kill in the same way. In fact, we know a lot of them don't. They do vary their modus operandi quite significantly. And when you look at the demographics of the victims, I would argue very strongly that Martha Tabram was a victim of Jack the Ripper. But there are researchers who've looked at all the murders and said actually Jack the Ripper only killed 3 people. Because they say there's some differences between some of the murders, that there's only 3 you can definitely say were the same perpetrator. Other people, of course, have gone on record and said that, you know, he committed all the ones in the police files plus some more. And concurrently, there was another serial killer operating in London in what is known as the Thames Torso Mysteries. And his modus operandi is very different, but it seems that the victims are from the same class of prostitutes. The difference primarily being that he would dissect the bodies in a private location, then dump them around London, usually in the Thames. Although at the height of the Ripper scare, he actually dropped some in the foundations of the New Scotland Yard, which I find a really interesting place to hide a body. And it's almost as if he wanted it to be discovered and was taunting the police, because to get into that location you had to get over a fence when the security weren't there, and you had and so to me, that if you've killed someone, you want to hide the body and you throw it in Thames, that's one thing, but to actually go and put it in plain sight where you know it's going to be discovered is very different. So if that was Jack the Ripper, then it would fit in with this idea that he was taunting the police through the letters, etc. But I think there's enough differences between the Thames killings and the Ripper murders to suggest they're not the same person. And then you come back to 2 different serial killers operating in a very small area at the same time. So, yeah, it's plausible that there were more than 5, and I think it needs to be looked into in a lot more detail before we can conclusively say there are only 5. Bearing in mind that the canonical 5 come from the observations of a police officer who wasn't actively involved in the Ripper case. Melville McNaughton was writing after the arrest of Thomas Cutbus to deny allegations that Cutbus was the Ripper, and when he did that, he explicitly stated that Jack the Ripper only killed 5 women. But when you look at 11 in the police file, I think you can certainly make a case for Tabram being included, and crucially, Alice Mackenzie, who was murdered the following year. And why I say crucially is that most people believe that Jack the Ripper stopped in November 1888. Now, if it can be shown that he was also around to kill Alice Mackenzie a few months later, then all those suspects who drop out of the equation in late 1888 because they've gone to an asylum like David Cohen, or they committed suicide like Montague Druitt, then they can't be Jack the Ripper.
Excellent. That's excellent.
I've really learned a lot.
Me too.
Very educational. There's a lot I thought I knew but didn't know. I didn't know as much as I thought. And after listening to Paul, it's been very educational.
And Bill,
learning about all this.
Bill says he died in prison before he could kill more than 5. So that's Bill's opinion. Just talking to him.
Who was Bill's suspect then?
Yeah,
it could be possible.
Oh, that's a good question. Okay, go ahead and ask your question, Phil, and I will ask Bill who his suspect is.
Any new projects you're working on that you'd like to tell us about?
I have a few things in the pipeline at the moment that I can't really say too much about, but I'm doing some spin-offs from Jack the Ripper. I've looked into some of the suspects in a lot more detail. I'd like to write a longer book on some of them. I've started researching the background of the last Ripper victim, Mary Kelly, to try and identify her, which is a very, very long project because a name like Mary Kelly, which may have been false, and you can imagine the difficulties there. I've got a spreadsheet of 660 women who may have been connected. But as with the suspects, when you start delving into that and you start looking at individuals, you see a wider story. A lot of these suspects, you can pick any of them at random and you can write articles and books about them. William Onion, for instance, who was for a while my favoured suspect, he was a drunk who was roaming around London, was frequently imprisoned. He actually was alleged to have 1,000 convictions, which would be a record if that can be verified. I've verified about 300 of them.
That's a lot of convictions. That's a lot.
Yeah. But the interesting about Onion is that he was born in Whitechapel and he married a lady, and on their wedding day he attacked her with a knife because he thought she was accepting money from a gentleman. And so the implication there is, of course, that he didn't like prostitutes. And he was accused at the time in a contemporary letter by someone who apparently knew him quite well. And he was very violent. The police themselves referred to him as one of the most violent men in London. But when I looked into it, I found he was probably in prison for the start of the Ripper murder, so it couldn't have been him, certainly the early ones. And then, amazingly, I found out that he was converted after a criminal career of over 50 years drunkenness. He converted to Christianity, and he spent the last decade of his life as a famous street poet, going around preaching against alcoholism. And he became friendly with the magistrates, who had previously obviously caused a lot of problems for him, to the extent that one of them even attended his funeral. He used to drop into police courts every year to say how well he'd been doing since he gave up alcohol for tea. He allegedly swapped beer for pints of tea, and credited that with his recovery. So it's a really interesting character. But he wasn't Jack the Ripper, but he's an interesting person in his own right. And I think they've all got stories, and it's good to be able to tell them.
Interesting.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Okay, I've heard back from Bill, our dear friend Bill. Bill's basically a librarian. He's not an actual librarian, but that's basically what he would be doing if he could be. He says, well, the boring one is Kaminsky, but I still want to believe a variant of Knight's fanciful Masonic theory. I don't, but I want to. So, that's what he says. So, I guess he's saying Kaminsky, so.
Okay.
Well, that's a good answer, though, Fox, because I think that goes back to the heart of it. People want to believe in those wider, more sensational theories. It's that instinct within us. We want to accept things that seem incredible. We want to believe in a wider conspiracy, because Kosminski is potentially a little bit boring as a study of a character, perhaps because we don't know as much about him. But yeah, I can understand someone would want to believe that it was the royal family and a group of political masons who were responsible.
Right, indeed. Well, It sounds great, the new projects you're doing, and I was reading you were doing an article on a 1960s episode of Doctor Who, which I'm...
Oh,
yeah,
yes. Yes. A couple of years ago, I started watching Doctor Who in order, one episode a week. So that's a long project. It's going to take about 18 years to complete, as you can understand.
Yeah.
And I'm just getting towards the end of the William Hartnell era. But there's a company who write books called the Black Archive. So they take individual Doctor Who episodes and they dissect them. Now, they've got an open submission period coming up later this year. And so anyone can send them an idea for a particular story they haven't already covered. So I'm going to submit a proposal on the gunfighters. Obviously, I'm competing against lots of people, so I can't say if it's going to be accepted or not. But I really find that story fascinating. Partly because of how its reputation has changed over time, because it had the lowest audience appreciation figures in history, below 30% for 3 of the episodes, and yet now it's regarded as a comedy classic.
It is,
yes. And it's, yes, and so I really want to get to the bottom of that. And what also interests me, which is related to this Jack the Ripper stuff as well, is the difference between the historical reality, because the gunfighters was not historical in my view. It was based on the westerns and the television series of the time, and it took all the fiction that they created around the Wild West and changed it some more. And so the historical Doctor Who's would try to stay true to history until that point. So they'd take a period of time or an event, and they wouldn't alter the facts. They might generate some fiction around it, but they make sure that what happened really happened. But the gunfighters basically chucked it all out the window, because the OK Corral gunfight is a historical event, but the gunfighters have got people there who weren't there. It's got people there who had died the year before and stuff like that, and it really changes the facts about the characters and the event.
Right.
So it's more of a pseudo history. So
that's
fascinating.
That's the episode they were calling the Doctor Doc Holliday. He was the dentist.
Yes, that's right.
Yes, this is Phil. I know you haven't seen the old Doctor Who. At least I don't think you've seen William Hartnell.
I have not.
But this is probably the single most painful episode of Camp Doctor Who that ever came out. Yeah, I remember the music. Like every 3 seconds, the Doctor was like, "I'll pull that tooth for you," and you'd hear this. Oh
man!
It was an English version to try to do a Doctor episode based on the bad Western movies that were coming over the pond at the time. And
it's funny in some ways, but it's different. And what I love about Doctor Who is the diversity in the storylines, that you can do something like that. You can have a camp Western, and then you can have a really serious sci-fi story afterwards, and you can have a fantasy the week before. And that third season is really, for me, great for that breadth in storytelling. There's so many different styles, so many different narratives, and it's really, really interesting.
It is a lot of fun, and he's right about the first couple of seasons of Doctor Who. They were doing stage plays, essentially, but they were taking historic subjects like the Romans, or Marco Polo, or the Aztecs was a wonderful idea, and they would take these wonderful historic settings and write these Shakespearean-like stage plays. Of course, the writing changed quite a bit later, but I sort of missed that. Of course, Tom Baker started doing a lot of the Greek myths. I was watching The Horns of the Nimon earlier on Pluto Television, and that's the Labyrinth story, and so it's a shame they got away from that, because I really loved their reinterpretations. Paul, this has been wonderful speaking to you, and I've learned quite a bit, and Bill's going to love this episode, keeping Bill alive. That's what we do for friends during the pandemic.
That's right.
Absolutely.
But this episode will keep him alive.
Yes, it will. Bill, stay alive. We will bring you more serial killers. He just showed me a picture of Ripperologist, the magazine still from the 1988 film. He played Averly, and he's showing me Ripperologist, so that's pretty cool. I told him pause an article in there. But we are on episode 144, Who Was Jack the Ripper, with author Paul Williams. Now, we have a great story coming up. This is an original that he donated to the show, and we really appreciate it, called Atonement of the Ripper. You can only get this here, and we'll have a copy of the episode up on our website at www.whatayouafraidofpodcast.com. So stay tuned as our English folk singer, our beloved David Walton, reads this incredible story at the end of the show. For our audience at ParaX Radio, we only get 58 minutes because Rebecca Brumble is such a tyrant. No, I understand. We have to stay in the limits of the show, and of course, our lovely ceiling cat is Barbara Duncan is right there to make sure we're staying on the train schedule, and we do longer episodes where you can download them from our various so many podcast services we're on at this point, or our website at www.whatayouafraidofpodcast.com. So we'll play as much as we can before the end of this episode, and then go over and hear the whole story on our website at www.whatayouafraidofpodcast.com. Listen to the whole episode because it's been incredible. Paul, thank you so much for speaking to us.
Well, thank you for having me.
Yes.
Very much appreciated. It's been a great conversation.
It's been a lot of fun.
Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah.
Really.
And of course, hopefully, I'm pretty sure, with this new anthology coming out from Gutter Books, that we'll be able to read a story that he contributed to that one. So, but like I said, I don't know the editor that well, but we'll see. We'll see. Wink, wink, nudge.
I can see you winking.
Yes, finally. But this has been episode 144, Who is Jack the Ripper, with author Paul Williams on What Are You Afraid of? Horror and Paranormal Show. We're on ParaX Radio, Friday nights at 9 p.m. Eastern Time. And check out our website at www.whatayouafraidofpodcast.com for all 143 episodes before this, plus our future episodes with authors like Grady Hendrix and Daniel Krauss and everybody else is coming on. This lady who loves haunted food, plus looks like my wife has just walked in with a glass of white wine, so I think this is a good place to end. This is T. Fox Dunham.
And I'm Phil Thomas.
Atonement of the Ripper. A short story written by Paul Williams and read by David Walton. I wake and see blood on the knife. Swatting flies, I lift the window latch, admitting stale air and the stench of the docks. Aaron! Mother calling. I kick the knife under a blanket and wipe my hands on the sheet. A kidney falls out. I wrap it and stumble downstairs. Marinos is reading a newspaper to a large group. Sunday. Mother watches my window. A dog rummages through the rubbish. I throw the kidney to it, then drop the sheet and wash my hands. Mother and Wolf look at me. They cannot know that I am the one Marinos talks about. 2 more murders, he shouts, translating into Yiddish. 1 outside our club. I remember lights inside and laughter drifting through open windows with Jewish music. A woman was at the gate, an unclean woman as old as Mother. She smelt of days of dirt and hours of alcohol. She taunted me with her eyes, trying to tempt me. Bear now the punishment of your lewdness and your harlotries. She was not the intended sacrifice. It was not her kidney. I ran when I heard a horse and found another whore I did not have time to finish. 1 more is needed. Killed, yells Marinos. The police have witnesses. They blame us again. We're ready, says a voice from the crowd that now numbers over 30. A policeman looks down the alley, then passes on. After the second murder, a group of labourers smash our doors and windows. They were soon released. Any Jew who breaks a Gentile's window goes to jail. If caught, I will hang on the end of a rope. He wrote to the newspapers, says Marinos, calls himself Jack the Ripper. Mother smiles. If the killer writes in English, then he is not me. Marinos stops reading. That can't be right. Was it a doctor? Someone asks. Some say the killer knew anatomy. I watch slaughtermen in the streets. They cannot afford rent. Even the Irish pay less than us. Marinos holds the small print closer to his eyes. What does it say? It says we have a home, a new Jewish state. He jumps off the box, waving the paper in the air. There was a meeting last week. The leaders of Russia, Britain, France, Austria, Turkey. They agreed to resettle us. We have a home. The crowd starts cheering and jumping around. Someone finds an instrument. I run back to my room and close the window. This is our home. We do not like it, but there is nowhere else. Nobody wants us. Aaron. Mother wakes me for the evening meal. Wolf bargained for a lamb and cooked it with a few vegetables. They are still talking about the news. Europe's rich countries paying for the passage to Poland for Jews who wish to leave. We fled from them, I say. Why should we go back? Our land, growls Wolf. Our land where we can be free to do what we want to do, where our synagogues will not be vandalized, where our women can walk in safety, where our skills will be paid for. I'm not leaving, I say. Mother touches my arm. This is for the best, she says. A new start. You can have your own shop. I don't want a shop. What do you want? Asks Wolf. To be forgiven by God. For what? My sins. I cannot say more. They will not understand. I am late for work because I returned the knife to the butcher's, placing it with others where it will not be found. Marinos is cross but soon calms. We are busy shaving and cutting hair. I know enough English to follow instructions. The men do not like us, but they come because Marinos is cheap. Most are dockers, fortunate to have earned enough yesterday not to work today. The smell of alcohol reminds me of the dead women. I concentrate, determined not to cut their skin. No blood will be spilt in Marinos' shop. Not his shop, McCarthy's shop. He waits for a free haircut. My customer leaves, shouting abuse and tossing me a coin. I point to the empty chair. I don't want the apprentice, says McCarthy, wiping his hand on his jacket. Anyone else wearing a suit in Whitechapel would be robbed. McCarthy walks in comfort amongst the unfortunates, the unemployed and the immigrants. He pays the police not to interfere on his patch. I sweep away the hair and lice outside. Are you going to Poland? Asks McCarthy, as Marinos shaves him. Marinos replies as if he had just decided. I am too old to move. I stay. The rent will go up, says McCarthy. Marinos' hand is steady. It is already high, he complains. Feel free to find another landlord who will rent to a Jew. I will the scissors to puncture the skin, but they don't. I am grateful for your support, says Marinos. Then you'll pay the increase? You may not find another tenant. I can get 8 beds in here. There is only room for 4 squashed next to each other. Enough dossers willing to find the money with winter coming. I would like to stay, says Marinos. Excellent. McCarthy stands and rubs his face. He glares at me. You're one of my tenants too, aren't you? Yes. Sir, Marinos reminds me. Sir, I mutter. Enjoy Poland, says McCarthy. Mother shows me a letter hand-delivered by McCarthy's assistant. I can't read English, but I know it's an eviction notice. I have seen them on the doors of houses let to Gentiles who hadn't paid rent. If they stay, McCarthy's assistant throws them into the street. Children, cripples, old women. Mother sometimes takes them to the workhouse or church. They won't enter the synagogue. It will become a doss house, says Mother. My sisters remove pictures from clean walls and wrap them in newspapers. You cannot stay here. Marinos is staying. There will be others. She sighs. Marinos is happy here, she says. We are his people. There is nobody to welcome him in Poland, she says. It is hard to start again when you are 70 years old and your eyesight is failing. We can embrace the promised land. He cannot. Still, she does not see. It isn't God's promised land, just space the Gentiles do not want. Marinos' shop is busy again. He talks in Yiddish because today's customers are all Jewish. Wolf lets me shave his beard. You cannot stay here alone, brother, he says. I have room, says Marinos. The boy can stay with me. I will take rent out of his salary. It is settled. The money I give to Mother will go instead to Marinos and pay his extra rent. The day of the Exodus arrives. Hundreds of Jews walk through the detritus of Whitechapel and past the barbers, carrying their belongings. I wave to those I know. Mother is with my sisters and Wolf. She cries. Wolf salutes me, then they pass. Small boys chase, yelling insults. A man shouts back. The boys stop. They assault the Jews, but they listen to the white man, even an Irish one. He comes in the shop. Hey, Joe, says Marinos, ushering him to the seat and touching his beard. You let it grow too much. No money, says Joe. These are my last coins. How is your lady friend? Joe lives in the last house on Dorset Street, one of McCarthy's tenants. From there, his girlfriend Marie entertains men while he carries fish at the market. In daylight, she stands on the doorstep, beckoning those who pass, tempting them, men and boys. I was returning from an errand to buy bread for Mother. McCarthy claimed to have none, so I left, the coins jingling in my pocket. Marie beckoned. I walked past, but she called, Don't you want me? Other whores are in their 40s. Mothers dragged closer to their grave by alcohol and abandoned by respectable men. Marie was young, with blonde hair and a clean body. She smelt nice. I gave her the bread money, and she made me unclean. I ran home afterwards without bread nor money. I grabbed a loaf from a baker's stall and fled. It is her fault. Her sin caused my sin. I left her, says Joe, lost my job. I understand. Marie could not entertain men with Joe at home. She made him leave. Now she is alone. This is the sacrifice I must make. Don't worry, says Marinos. Free food next week. The Lord Mayor's show. He nods to me. I will be closed. The police want the streets free for the procession. They deprive you of your business, I told him, knowing that Marinos will have to open on the Sabbath to recover. It's their country, Marinos says, not ours. It is the evening before the show. I wait for the last customer to leave, then put the money in the tin and sweep while Marinos prepares dinner. He has struggled since lunchtime, his hands slipping and cutting 2 customers. He has kept the day's newspaper. After eating, he removes the plates and takes out the Torah, his only book, and a big reading glass. He sits on the floor as close to the candles as he can get, studying the small print of first the Torah, then the newspaper. "Pray with me," he urges. I tell him I am going for a walk and hope that he does not see the knife in my pocket. I wait in a doorway near Marie's house, watching. She staggers up the street, talking to others of her kind. None of them see me. There are richer men to notice. She comes back with a blotchy-faced man who carries a pail of beer. Some spills on the path. A child pushes away a dog to lick it first. Marie does not unlock the door, but puts her arm through a broken window and releases a latch. The man places his free hand around her waist. She blasphemes as the glass cuts her skin. I wait in the rain. The man comes out with an empty pail. He stumbles by me, too drunk to remember. Still, nobody else looks. Marie goes out and soon returns with a taller, more prosperous-looking man. I wait. He leaves. Finally, her light goes out. I sneak across and put my arm through the window. She is on the bed, snoring like a pig. I pull back the door latch and enter. She stirs. Her eyes start to open. I cover her mouth and begin. It is getting light as I return. Marinos is sitting on my bed, waiting. He sees what I am carrying, but is not surprised. "We have known for a long time," he said. "People saw you. Good men who told me and your brother, but not the police. If your family had stayed and it continued, then maybe we would have sought a cure. I do not need a cure." He laughed. "Fetch me the newspaper," he said. Obediently, I gave it to him, realizing that he would never stand on a box reading again. Instead, he tells me what it says. The boats containing the Jewish refugees were destroyed by order of Her Majesty's government. At the same time, the other European nations who arranged the transfer of their Jews by land began destroying the vehicles. Europe has acted together to rid itself of the cursed people. Marinos passes the paper to me. I wrap Marie's heart in it. "You have atoned for your sins," says Marinos. "Now you must make them atone for theirs." I pick up the knife and head outside.
Can you ask him if he can write a better ending? This is my wife. T. Fox Dunham lives in Philadelphia with his wife Allison. He's a lymphoma survivor, cancer patient, modern bard and historian. His first book, The Street Martyr, was published by Gutter Books. A television series based on the book is being produced by Throughline Films. Destroying the Tangible Illusion of Reality or Searching for Andy Kaufman, a book about what it's like to be dying of cancer, was released from Perpetual Motion Machine Publishing, and Fox has a story in the Stargate anthology Points of Origin from MGM and Fandemonium Books. Fox is an active member of the Horror Writers Association, and he's had published hundreds of short stories and articles. His motto is Wrecking Civilization, one story at a time. Find out more information at www.tfoxdunham.com.
Phil Thomas is an author and screenwriter from the suburbs of Philadelphia. His screenplays have been produced into 2 feature films, False Face and Always from Darkness, and are available in major retailers such as Best Buy and Target, as well as availability on Netflix and Amazon Prime on demand. His screenplay, 3 Tunnels, was a semi-finalist at the LA Screenplay Competition. He is a member of the International Association of Professional Writers and Editors, and he currently writes for Cultured Vultures, Game Skinny, and BloodyDisgusting.com. He formerly held the position of Senior Marketing Manager at Eternal Press, and was a journalist for Patch, where he wrote a daily tech column covering the latest electronics and gadgets. He lives in the suburbs of Philadelphia, and is currently working on his 2nd novel, Worst Afterlife Ever.
The views expressed and the opinions given by the individual host and their guests do not necessarily reflect those of Para X, its affiliates, or its sponsors.